In 1959, a brand new .22 rifle cost less than $17 in the Sears catalog, and half the boys in America wanted one under the Christmas tree. It was how you learned. One shot, one squirrel, one lesson about patience. Your father drove home on a fence line. But most of these rifles are gone now, tucked in closets or sold off at estate sales for pocket change. These are the 15 forgotten .22 rifles that taught generations of American boys to shoot. Let's count them down, starting with number 15. Number 15. The Savage Model 6 slipped into American homes the quiet way, without fanfare and without much money changing hands. Built by Savage and its Stevens line starting in the late 1930s, it was a tube-fed semi-automatic that fed on shorts, longs, and long rifle without complaint. And that alone made it a favorite of fathers who didn't want to explain the difference to a 9-year-old on a cold morning. It sold for around $15 when a day's wages weren't much more, and it earned that price back one rabbit at a time. The barrel warmed under the sun as a boy plinked tin cans off a fence rail, the little rifle spitting empties into the weeds, while a father corrected a grip, a stance, a breath held too long. It was not a beautiful gun. The stock was plain birch, the bluing thin, the sights nothing to brag about, but it worked. And it kept working through mud and neglect and being leaned in the wrong corner of the barn. Old-timers who learned on one remember the soft metallic clatter of the action and the way the tube seemed to hold more rounds than a boy could count. When cheaper imports and flashier models crowded the shelves in the 1960s, the humble Savage faded from the catalogs. Today it turns up at farm auctions, sold for a few dollars beside the coffee cans and the socket wrenches. Its story mostly forgotten by the families it once fed. Number 14, the Mossberg Model. 44 US was the rifle that taught America to aim, not just to point. Where most .22s were toys grown boys were allowed to keep, the 44 was serious business, a heavy bolt-action target rifle with a full-length stock, a sling, and precision peep sights that demanded discipline from the shooter. The military bought thousands of them during the war years of the early 1940s to train recruits cheaply, and the NRA and the schools that ran junior rifle programs bought thousands more. A boy who learned on a 44 learned the hard way, prone on a mat with a leather sling biting into his arm, squeezing rather than pulling, calling his shot before the target came back. That weight, nearly 9 pounds, steadied a young shooter's nerves and turned wobble into stillness. Instructors drilled the fundamentals until they became instinct, and the paper targets came home to be tacked on bedroom walls like report cards. A quarter-inch group meant something. It meant a boy had done the work. When the war ended and surplus rifles flooded the market, the 44s were scattered, some to gun clubs, some to attics, many simply worn out on the firing line. The great junior marksmanship programs that gave the rifle its purpose thinned out over the decades. Today, the Mossberg 44 survives mostly in the memories of men who can still feel that sling and still remember the voice of a coach telling them to slow down and breathe. It was never glamorous, but it built shooters the way nothing else did. Number 13, the Winchester Model 74 loaded from a place no boy today would think to look, straight down through the buttstock, and that oddity is half of what people remember about it. Introduced in 1939 and built until the mid-1950s, this semi-automatic fed from a tube that ran through the stock itself, a slim brass rod pulled out to drop the cartridges in one after another until the boy lost count. Around 400,000 of them left the factory, and a good share went to families who wanted a Winchester name without a Winchester price. It carried well in the crook of an arm along a tree line, light and quick to the shoulder, and it dispatched barn rats and garden thieves with a reassuring regularity. The bluing was deep for a gun in its class, the walnut modest but honest, and it had the balance that made a boy feel like he could actually hit something. Fathers liked it because the loading kept small fingers away from the muzzle end of the magazine. Boys liked it because it looked like a real rifle, not a starter toy. When Winchester retired the model in 1955 to make room for cheaper, faster-built guns, the 74 quietly slipped out of production and out of memory. It rarely gets the reverence given to the company's lever guns, and most people who see one now have no idea how to load it. But for the boys who grew up feeding cartridges down that hollow stock, it was the first rifle that felt like it belonged to them alone. Number 12, the Remington Model 121. Fieldmaster had the smoothest pump action a farm boy ever worked, and once you'd handled one, the memory of that slide never quite left you. Built from 1936 into the mid-1950s, it was the gallery gun brought home. A slick takedown pump that let a shooter cycle rounds nearly as fast as he could aim. The forend rode back and forth on a polished action, and there was a rhythm to it. Aim, fire, pump, aim, that turned an afternoon of plinking into something close to music. It fed shorts, longs, and long rifle from a tube beneath the barrel, and it swallowed a lot of them. At around $20 in its day, it cost more than a plain single shot, but a father buying one knew he was buying a rifle a boy would keep for life. The wood was good American walnut, the machining clean, the whole gun built to a standard Remington was still proud of. Squirrels dropped from oaks, cans danced off stumps, and a boy learned the discipline of the follow-up shot without ever taking the rifle from his shoulder. When the tide turned toward the inexpensive semi-automatics in the 1950s, the slow, careful craftsmanship of the 121 became too costly to continue. Remington let it go. Today, the Fieldmaster is a collector's quiet secret, prized by the men who know how a real pump gun should feel, and mourned by those who let one slip away at a yard sale before they understood what they had. Number 11. The J.C. Higgins Model 103 came from a catalog, not a gun shop. And for millions of American families, that made all the difference. J.C. Higgins was the Sears house brand, and the rifles that wore the name were built by respected makers like High Standard, then stamped with the store's own label and sold for a few dollars less than the name brand equivalent. The Model 103 was a simple bolt action, and it arrived on the porch in a cardboard box beside the seat order and the winter coats. No paperwork, no lecture, just a rifle and a boy's first taste of ownership. For rural families 100 miles from the nearest sporting goods store, the Sears catalog was the gun store, and the Higgins line armed a generation that might otherwise have gone without. It was accurate enough to teach a steady hold, cheap enough that a dent in the stock didn't break a father's heart, and tough enough to ride in a truck bed through every kind of weather. Boys learned to shoot with it exactly the way they learned everything else on the farm, by doing, by failing, by trying again, until the can stopped standing up. When Sears wound down its firearms business, and the house brands disappeared from the pages, the Higgins name went with them. Today, the guns are orphans, unloved by collectors who chase the big names, treasured only by the families who remember the day the box came in the mail. Number 10, the Ithaca Model 49 saddle gun let a boy pretend he was a cowboy while he learned to shoot straight, and that piece of theater sold a lot of rifles. Introduced in 1961, it looked like a scaled-down lever-action carbine, the kind of gun that rode in a saddle scabbard in every Western on the black and white television set. But the lever didn't cycle cartridges the way a boy expected. It was a single shot, a dropping block action that ejected the spent case and cocked the rifle when the lever swung, forcing the young shooter to load each round by hand. That was the genius of it. A boy got the swagger of a lever gun and the discipline of a single shot in one rifle, and he learned to make each shot count because there was no second one waiting. It cost around $20, and it landed under a great many Christmas trees through the 1960s and into the 1970s. The little carbine was light and lively, easy for small hands, and forgiving of the scratches and dings that came with being a boy's constant companion. Ithaca sold versions with gold triggers and fancy stocks to tempt the grandparents, but the plain models did the real work. When the company's fortunes shifted and cheaper competition crowded in, the saddle gun was discontinued. Today it survives in the closets of men who were once 9 years old and convinced, for one bright autumn, that they were riding the range. Number 9. The Winchester Model 69 was the honest workhorse of the bolt-action world, the rifle that turned careless plinkers into careful shooters without anyone noticing the lesson. Built from 1935 through the early 1960s, it was a bolt-action repeater fed from a detachable box magazine, and that magazine changed everything about how a boy learned. He could load 5 or 10 rounds, but he still had to work the bolt between each shot lifting his head, resetting, aiming fresh, and that pause was where the marksmanship lived. It sold for a modest price through the Depression years and beyond, and Winchester got offered a target version with peep sights that armed countless school and club shooting teams. The rifle had heft and balance that flattered a young shooter, and the bolt ran smooth enough to cycle without breaking a cheek weld. Fathers trusted it because the box magazine could be pulled and pocketed, rendering the gun safe with a single motion when chores called. Boys trusted it because it hit what they aimed at over and over until confidence became competence. The Model 69 never wore the romance of the lever guns or the flash of the semi-autos, and that plainness is exactly why it faded. When Winchester dropped it in the early 1960s, few noticed it was gone. But the men who cut their teeth on a 69 will tell you it taught them more about shooting than any rifle they owned after, precisely because it made them slow down. Number 8. The Remington Model 514 was the cheapest ticket into shooting a family could buy, and for a whole generation of American boys, it was the first rifle, period. Introduced in 1948 and built for more than 2 decades, it was a bare-bones, single-shot bolt-action, no magazine, no frills, just a boy, a bolt, and one cartridge at a time. That simplicity was the entire point. A father handed a boy a 514 knowing there was no way to spray rounds carelessly, no second shot to lean on, nothing to do but make the one shot good. It cost only a handful of dollars, less than a decent pair of boots, and Remington built it by the hundreds of thousands because every small town in America seemed to need one. The stock was plain hardwood, the sights simple open notches, and the whole rifle asked nothing of a family but the price and a safe place to keep it. Boys learned the sacred rhythm on a 514 load, close the bolt, aim, breathe, squeeze, then open it up and watch the empty case tumble into the grass. Squirrels fell, cans clattered, and lessons about patience sank in deeper than any lecture ever could. When the market shifted toward repeaters and the profit in a $5 rifle vanished, Remington let the 514 go. Today it sells for almost nothing, passed over by collectors, but it remains one of the truest teaching rifles this country ever produced. Number 7. The Stevens favorite earned its name honestly, and for the better part of 40 years, it was the rifle America handed its children. First built in 1889 and produced into the 1930s, with revivals long after, it was a little falling block single shot that broke down into 2 pieces with the turn of a thumbscrew, small enough to slip into a saddlebag or a boy's grip without trouble. A lever behind the trigger dropped the block. The empty case flipped clear and a fresh cartridge went in by hand, one careful round at a time. It sold for a few dollars in the mail order catalogs of the day, and it armed farm boys and town boys alike across the turn of the century when a .22 was as ordinary a possession as a pocket knife. The favorite was accurate far beyond its price, with a crisp trigger and a slim barrel that rewarded a steady hold, and grandfathers who learned on one passed both the rifle and the technique down through the decades. Its takedown design meant it traveled everywhere, riding along on hunts and fishing trips and long walks to nowhere in particular. By the time the Depression squeezed the last of the original production, the favorite had already taught more American boys to shoot than almost any rifle before it. It faded as repeaters took over, but its name lingered, and its lineage runs straight through the heart of how this country first learned marksmanship. Number 6. The Winchester Model 62 came straight off the carnival midway and into the family barn, and it brought all the fun of the shooting gallery with it. Built from 1932 until 1958, it was a slide-action pump modeled on the gallery guns that had entertained fairgoers for generations. The ones bolted to the counter where a nickel bought a chance at a tin duck. The Model 62 fed shorts, longs, and long rifle from a tube under the barrel, and a boy could work that pump so fast the cans hardly had time to fall. There was a joy in it that plainer rifles couldn't match, a rhythm of slide and shot that made an afternoon disappear. It cost around $15 to $20 in its heyday, and it earned a reputation for reliability that kept it in production for more than a quarter century. Amusement parks and shooting galleries bought them by the crate, their barrels worn bright from a million rounds, and families bought them to bring that same delight home. A boy learned to lead a moving target, to trust his rhythm, to shoot with both eyes open and a grin on his face. The Model 62 made marksmanship feel like play, which is exactly why the lesson stuck. When cheaper guns undercut it in the late 1950s, Winchester ended production. Today, the survivors are cherished, especially the gallery guns with their stories worn into the steel, relics of an America that learned to shoot for the pure fun of knocking something down. Number 5. The Marlin Model 39. A was the aristocrat of the .22 world, the lever action that a boy grew into rather than out of, and it carried a bloodline that ran clear back to the 1890s. Built from 1939 onward, with roots in the model 1891 that preceded it, the 39A was a takedown lever gun of genuine quality, the kind of rifle a father bought once and expected to bury his grandchildren with. It fed shorts, longs, and long rifle interchangeably from a tube magazine, cycled with the same satisfying stroke as the big bore deer guns, and shot with an accuracy that shamed rifles costing far more. It was not cheap. At $30 or more, when lesser rifles sold for half that, the 39A was an investment, a rifle a family saved for and a boy understood he was lucky to hold. That very seriousness made it a superb teacher, because a boy handled a fine rifle with the care a fine rifle deserved. The lever taught the rhythm of the follow-up shot, the takedown design taught cleaning and respect, and the walnut stock taught pride of ownership. Squirrels came home for the pot, and the rifle went back in the rack gleaming. Marlin kept the 39 line alive for the better part of a century, longer than almost any American rifle. But the model faded from everyday awareness as plastic and stamped steel took over the market. It endures now as an heirloom, the .22 that fathers still hand down when they mean something by it. Number 4. The Remington Nylon 66 was the rifle from the future, the gun that traded walnut and steel for a synthetic stock and dared a generation to notice. Introduced in 1959, it broke every rule about what a rifle was supposed to look like. The stock was molded nylon, tough and slick and impervious to the weather that swelled and cracked wooden guns, and the whole rifle was so light and so nearly maintenance-free that it seemed almost unfair. Remington built well over 1 million of them before production ended in the late 1980s, making it one of the most popular .22s the company ever produced. Boys loved it because it looked like nothing their fathers had owned, a space-age rifle for the age of rockets and television, and because the tube-fed semi-automatic action ran through cartridges with a speed that made cans jump. It cost around $50, and it delivered a reliability that made believers out of skeptics who swore a plastic gun would never last. It rode in canoes and truck beds and got left out in the rain, and it kept shooting anyway. Farm boys learned that a rifle didn't have to be beautiful to be trusted, and that the future had a way of arriving whether the old-timers approved or not. When Remington finally retired the Nylon 66, an era ended. Today, the rifle is a genuine collector's item, oddly rare given how many were made, and a reminder of the day America's boys first learned to shoot with a rifle made of something other than wood. Number 3. The Ruger 10/22 arrived in 1964 and never really left, but the plain little carbine that taught millions of boys has quietly become a stranger to its own legend. When it launched at around $54, it was simply a well-made semi-automatic with a clever rotary magazine that sat flush in the stock and fed with a reliability nothing else could match. That magazine was the secret. It didn't stick out to snag on brush, it didn't jam, and it turned a boy loose to plink and hunt and learn without the constant fussing that plagued lesser guns. The 10/22 was light, handy, and accurate enough to teach real marksmanship, and it forgave the abuse that came with being a boy's everyday rifle. Fathers appreciated that it was built to last, boys appreciated that it just worked in, and a whole generation learned the fundamentals on that short barrel and simple stock. It came home for Christmas and birthdays across the middle decades of the century, and it dispatched squirrels and cans and the occasional garden raider with cheerful efficiency. In the years since, the 10/22 became a hobbyist's canvas, buried under aftermarket barrels and stocks and gadgets, until the plain original nearly disappeared beneath the modifications. The rifle that taught so many boys to shoot straight got lost inside the culture it created. But strip away the accessories, and there it still is, the honest little carbine that quietly did more to teach American shooting than almost anything before it. Number 2. The Marlin Model 60 is the rifle more American boys learned on than any other, and yet most people who owned one never even knew its name. Introduced in 1960 and produced by the many millions across the decades, it became the best-selling rifle in American history. A tube-fed semi-automatic that sold through every department store and hardware counter in the country for the price of a good pair of shoes. It was ordinary in the best possible way. The stock was birch, the action simple, the whole rifle built to a price that put it within reach of any family that wanted one, and then nearly every family did. It arrived under Christmas trees in numbers no other rifle could touch, and it taught its lessons without ceremony. One tin can and one treed squirrel at a time. A boy could carry it all day, shoot it all afternoon, and leave it standing in the corner of the mudroom, and it asked almost nothing in return. That very ubiquity is why it's forgotten now, because a thing that common becomes invisible, taken for granted, remembered only as the .22, never by its proper name. Marlin sold so many that the Model 60 became less a rifle than a rite of passage. The gun a boy simply had the way he had a bicycle and a dog. It quietly outsold every rifle in the nation and quietly slipped from memory anyway. But somewhere in nearly every American family that ever went shooting, there was a Model 60, and it taught the boys to shoot. Number 1. The Winchester Model 67 was the rifle that taught America to shoot. The humble, single shot, handed from father to son across 3 decades, and it earns the top of this list precisely because it never tried to be anything more. Built from 1934 through 1963, it was a plain bolt-action single shot, no magazine, no repeater speed, no shortcut of any kind, just a boy and one cartridge, and the long lesson of making that single shot matter. It cost only a few dollars all through the Depression and the war years, and the prosperity that followed, cheap enough that the poorest farm could afford one, and proud enough that a boy kept it his whole life. The genius of the 67 was in what it withheld. With no second shot waiting, a boy had to learn patience, had to learn the trigger squeeze, had to learn to hold his breath and call his target before he ever touched off, because there was no spray and hope to fall back on. Fathers loved it for exactly that reason, and they handed it down deliberately, from the oldest child to the youngest, from one generation to the next, until a single Model 67 had taught an entire family line to shoot. The rifle came home on countless first hunts, tacked countless first targets to countless bedroom walls, and stood in the corner of countless kitchens as ordinary as a broom. When Winchester discontinued it in 1963, few marked the moment, and today the rifle sells for pocket change beside far flashier guns. But no rifle in American history taught more boys the true discipline of the single, careful shot, and that is why the forgotten little Model 67 stands quietly at number 1. Those are the 15 forgotten .22 caliber rifles that raised a nation of shooters. If one of these was your first rifle or your father's, tell me which one in the comments and tell me the story that came with it. Somewhere out there is a boy who still remembers the day the box came in the mail and the fence line where he learned to hold his breath. These rifles are getting harder to find, but the lessons never left. If this brought back a memory, do me a favor and subscribe, because we're just getting started.